Floor is yours, Mark.
Thank you, Lou. Want to thank Lou for helping us out with the technical aspects of this meeting. My name is Mark Dunlea, and I'm one of the co-chairs of the EcoAction Committee of the Green Party of the United States. I'll be presenting mainly about some of the climate issues we're doing, particularly around eco-socialist Green New Deal and our work to stop fossil fuels. Justin Paglino, who is one of the members of our committee from Connecticut, been a Green Party candidate for Congress several times. Is a doctor, also I believe very active around the single-payer issues. He'll give a more formal presentation, bunch of slides, and I believe carbon tax will be one of the of several issues that I'll be talking about. Briefly, EcoAction is a committee set up at the national level to try to help coordinate work by the Green Party nationally around various environmental issues. You can go to the Green Party National website, gp.org, I believe /platform, and there is a sustainability section that talks about a number of the issues that we have worked on. The committee itself for the last couple of years has been very focused on the issue of climate change, particularly trying to promote an eco-socialist Green New Deal, and also to get the everybody, federal, state, local, international community to, say no to fossil fuels and to move as quickly as possible to transition to, real zero emissions. But there are quite a few other issues, within the Green Party platform, things like mass transit, the issue of public power. We'll talk a little bit more about that. Regenerative agriculture. In fact, we're going to be doing the EcoAction Committee meets the second Monday of each month at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and we often have webinars. The one on August 14th will be on the issue of issue of agriculture and climate change. Zero waste, water is a basic human right, biological diversity, and particularly rights in nature have been some of the other issues that we work on. EcoAction Committee itself has up to 3 members from each of the, official Green Party states around the country, and then the various caucuses at the national level: the Women's Caucus, Lavender Caucus, Black Caucus. Another can also appoint members to that. As I said, the eco-socialist Green New Deal has been one of the real focal points for our work. I was Howie Hawkins' campaign manager when he ran for governor of New York State back in 2010. At that point, we were helping to lead the fight to stop the fracking of natural gas in our state, something we were successful at 5 years later. But one of the things we did in 2010 was we were probably the first political entity in the United States to call for a Green New Deal. To be honest, the Green Party in Europe, particularly the United Kingdom, had called for a Green New Deal back in 2008, partly in response to the international meltdown of the financial community. We saw that here in the United States, particularly around the housing bubble posted. So Howie and us decided to take what they had talked about in Europe and then, make it a little bit more United States centric. And we had, sort of 2 main points. One was a very rapid transition to zero emissions. We actually set a 10-year timeline. People talk a lot now these days about 2030. Our initial timeline was 2020. And that requires us not only to stop all new fossil fuels, particularly things such as fracking for natural gas, seeing natural gas as methane from natural gas is 80 times more potent short term, 20 years than actually carbon is, but also new fossil fuels and structures, and then an economic Bill of Rights, and that reflects the concept that in order to build public support for a transition to a clean energy future, we have to make everyone believe and understand that they're going to be taken care of as well. And that's why we articulated, much as FDR had done in his last State of the Union address, an economic bill of rights, starting with the right to a living wage job, which we also expanded to include guaranteed income for all, universal health care, particularly single payer, improved and expanded Medicare for all, and then other key economic issues, particularly the right to affordable housing, quality affordable housing, and also the um, right to education, including the right to free college education, at least at a public university. And that was also one of the things that particularly Jill Stein, picked up in her later campaigns for president, was the issue of abolishing student debt. And so that was the original, Green New Deal. And of course, the issue of climate has only become worse, since then. A lot of people are saying that, the summer of 2023 maybe might become the point in which the world really finally gets to be serious, that we have to solve climate change or this extreme weather that we've been seeing this summer with record heat waves, not only here in the United States, but also in the other parts of the world, including Europe, including Asia. The wildfires, here I'm based in New York, and the smoke that's been coming down from the Canadian wildfires this year has tremendously decreased air quality. One day last month, New York City had the worst air quality on the planet, even worse than Delhi in India, which is normally the worst. And then Chicago, I think a week or the week before, was the worst in the world. And of course, the floods, and of course, over the years we've seen other extreme weather, particularly hurricanes. As we say, climate change doesn't necessarily create extreme weather, but it makes existing weather more extreme. It provides more energy because of all the heat, and so the hurricanes are more powerful. The floods become 100-year floods in the Hudson Valley. It was a millennium, once every 1,000-year flood, last month. And even the head of the United Nations has made the point, code red for the planet, that our politicians are not standing up to the fossil fuel companies, and that the timetables, the actions they have taken are not sufficient to avoid climate collapse. Climate collapse being trying to keep climate warming, global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius. Most scientists believe we will now pass that figure within the next 5 years. And in fact, on some days, we have already passed the 1.5 degrees. And getting beyond 1.5 degrees, not only does extreme weather become more common, but it begins to pose an existential threat. And there's certainly questions as to how well human beings can survive extreme heat and floods and rising oceans. But I think the bigger question is whether our society can adequately respond to escalating crises. In the United States, we saw a very poor response to Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, certainly Hurricane Sandy in New York and New Jersey, and elsewhere. Saw a real disparity between how low income and more wealthier communities are done. And then, of course, throughout the world, a lot of developing countries have a difficult time just providing basic services to their population, and they are less equipped to deal with these escalating extreme weather events. Plus, there is the problem that they're not the ones responsible. The United States, cumulatively, has had the largest amount of global greenhouse gas emissions. More currently, China, tends to be at the top of the list on an annual basis. But the reality is, since the Paris Climate Accords, what's it now, 6-7 years ago, global greenhouse gas emissions continue to increase. And this year will be the highest on record. And so, besides promoting the eco-socialist Green New Deal, which is quite a bit different than what Democrats have proposed. Even progressive Democrats like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez represents, I believe, Queens and the Bronx down in New York City, never actually called to halt new fossil fuels. Never said no to nuclear power. Initially did talk about a 2030 timeline, but net zero emissions, not real zero emissions. And then more recently, we've gone to 2050. One of the things that we called initially, on how to finance the Green New Deal was to cut the military budget by at least 50%. I think many of us would say should be bigger than that, but I believe that's the national party's position. And of course, that's the one thing that Democrats and Republicans agree upon is, excuse me, whatever the president proposes in terms of increase in the military budget, the Democrats and Republicans in Congress all vote to give even more money to the military than what the president proposes in the budget. We also called, for some form of carbon tax, carbon fee, and dividend, but the general concept that polluters should pay for the damages they created. And then, of course, as always, tax the wealthy. And particularly it is low-income people of color, who bear the brunt of climate change. The wealthy have benefited financially from it, and they should pay for it. One of the things we did 2 years ago, we joined, at that point it was called Build Back Fossil Free. It has since changed its name to People versus Fossil Fuels. It made the point that we needed to halt new fossil fuels, but it also put together a very comprehensive package of executive orders that whoever the president would be, in this case President Biden, could implement without the need for congressional approval because the underlying legislation had already been passed. And the reality is that Congress really has not passed any major environmental legislation, for 30 or 40 years. And certainly the gridlock we've seen at the federal level over the last 5 to 10 years makes the idea that Congress, even if it was inclined to take action, very unlikely they could actually come to agreement on any type of climate agenda. And that is why we focus on these series of executive orders that the president could do. At the same time, we did push for a robust investment in a transition to renewable energy. That's the one thing that the Democrats could do in the United States Senate, budget reconciliation with only 50 votes rather than, the 60 votes needed to defeat a filibuster. I forget, Howie Hawkins outlined how much it would cost for our Green New Deal. It was about $10 trillion a year. I think initially Biden may have been talking, a couple $100 million. But by the time they actually passed the Inflation Reduction Act, it was a tenth of what even Biden initially proposed, and that's not been good. But we work with people for fossil fuels on other issues like trying to fight the Mountain Valley Pipeline, Line 3 out in Minnesota. On September 17th, a lot of groups are going to hold a rally in New York City in conjunction with the special meeting that the United Nations frequently holds on the climate issue. The EcoAction Committee has endorsed that particular event. I believe we're in the process of trying to get the Green Party National Committee to also endorse it, but we'll have a delegation, we'll try to march together. We did do that 4 years ago, right after Trump first won inauguration. We participated in the April, 100,000 people in D.C. This probably won't be quite as big, but we are expecting tens of thousands, and it'll be quite good to see the Green Party, have a coordinated presence at that. Just a couple, other quick things. One of the things I really say to a lot of climate groups, I've done a lot of climate work over the last decade. I've been, doing that for 30, 40 years, but the last 10 years is what I focused my attention on. I helped coordinate the successful campaign to divest both the New York City and the New York State public pension funds from fossil fuels. Those are the second and third largest public pension plans in the country. Been a lot of work with 350.org, Food and Water Watch, Green Party, and things of that. But one of the things I tell the Green Party, tell the climate movement in general, we need to be clear. We need to end capitalism. Okay? We are not going to solve climate change by giving a lot of money to hedge funds and other developers to build more renewable energy. We have to change the complete mindset of how our economy and political system works. Instead of making most decisions based on what will maximize the wealth for the 1%, we need to focus on what is best for the common good, what is sustainable, and ensure that everybody benefits from that. Easiest on the energy sector should have public ownership, but public ownership must be accompanied by community control. Having these public entities where basically politically connected, the 1% end up being the board of directors, that's not, public control. And so just in New York State recently, the state, through a lot of pressure from climate activists, did authorize the New York Power Authority, existing public power entity in New York State, to build public renewables, but unfortunately they did not change the way that the New York Power Authority operates. Interestingly, Pope Francis, when he put out his climate encyclical, when he first came to his position, made that point, that capitalism cannot be sustained, that the mentality that drives capitalism, that allows the rich to exploit the poor, that allows men to exploit women, that contributes to racism and homophobia, is the same mentality that allows human beings to exploit the other beings on this planet and on the environment. Actually, the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Planet on Climate Change, also has said we must end capitalism. For some reason, they don't put that in the headlines, but in their most recent report, they made the point that making economic decisions on a capitalism that's based on the concept of continual growth cannot continue if we want to avoid climate change. And actually, I was pretty excited to see Greta Thunberg recently, Swedish youth climate activist, Fridays for the Future, has also become much more vocal about the need to oppose capitalism. That is not something that the mainstream staff-funded, foundation-funded climate groups are willing to say. So I think that's a particularly important role of the Green Party to say, to make that point that capitalism is not the answer. And in fact, we need a revolution. We need to create a different type of world, a world that is committed to the well-being of all, and not the wealth of a few. Kind of beginning to run out of my time a little bit before we get to Justin. A couple of things I did want to mention was the need to oppose false climate solutions. Mentioned nuclear power. Nuclear power is something I started working on 50 years ago. All the reasons to oppose it 50 years ago is too expensive, is too dangerous. What do you do for 100,000 years with the radioactive waste that's produced? All that's still true. Nuclear power is not carbon free. It is low carbon, but it's not carbon free. There's a lot of carbon expended both in building the nuclear power plants and also in the mining and the processing of the nuclear fuel, which also raises the issue of their negative impact upon indigenous nations and people, which is often where the uranium is done. One of the real things that we fight over a bit, even in EcoAction, is the issue of carbon capture and sequestration. Um, I think many of us view what's being promoted as a way to bail out the fossil fuel industry. It's another corporate greenwashing, corporate welfare. One of the things a lot of people don't understand is that, when the IPCC says that we need to cut global greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 in order to have a chance of avoiding going above 1.5 degrees warming, they actually admit that cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 50% by 2030 is grossly inadequate to keep um, global warming below 1.5 degrees. What they say is because it's grossly inadequate, that we need to invest tens of billions of dollars in carbon capture technology to pull the excess carbon out of the atmosphere. They acknowledge that after several decades of research and tens of billions of dollars of money invested, there is no evidence that carbon capture technology is economically viable. Um, but yet, Democrats in the United States have literally voted to put, at this point, well over $10 billion into carbon capture. There are alternative ways to do carbon capture. There are um, natural ways, rebuilding, coastal habitats. Some people do oyster beds. There's some work being done in Iceland on mineral extraction with volcanic ash. Some people, like David Schwartzman, who's part of the EcoAction committee, is a climate scientist at Howard University, does make the point that probably some carbon capture is going to be needed. But what is being promoted by the Democrats and by the fossil fuel industry and even by the IPCC, that's not the solution. Things like biomass and others, we could go on. What can be done locally? Run for office. Having the Green Party actually have somebody articulating that in New York we have the greatest climate law ever passed in the world. Well, that possibly may be true. It's just completely inadequate to avoid climate collapse. So telling us that you're better than the rest of the scoundrels isn't a solution. So let's talk about what you can do. How do you decarbonize buildings? How do you change the building codes in your community? How do you promote mass transit? How do you promote bicycles? How do you promote walking? How do you take steps against sprawl? Those are all things that can be done at the local level. And as this money begins to roll out from the Inflation Reduction Act, grossly inadequate, it's still going to be a grab bag for local corporate interests to try to grab it. And it'd be good to have the Green Party out there articulating ways it can be done, and particularly to articulate, well, let's do more municipally owned, renewable solar farms in our community or wind farms or that nature. Um, I'm going to stop there and turn it over to Justin, and Justin will give his presentation, and then we're going to come back and open it up to questions. You can put it in the chat box. So, as I said, Justin's from Connecticut, two-time candidate for Congress for the Green Party, a doctor. So, Justin.
Thank you, Mark. That was excellent, and it really gives us a sense of, how many ways there are to come at this problem. There really isn't one solution. There are myriad solutions, and we really just need all hands on deck coming at this and being the most effective they can in their sphere of influence to make a difference on in a variety of ways. There's so many aspects of our infrastructure that need to be reorganized to become lower carbon emitting. So I will share my screen. Does everybody see that okay?
I can see it.
All right. So I call this Climate Breakdown, the Necessary Solutions. For anybody who heard Peter Kalmus's talk, keynote address, you know that we are really in dire straits. Peter did an excellent job of outlining the science and the scope and the scale of the problem, which is enormous and tremendous and existential. So we are here in the Green Party, we want to be part of the solution. We want to mitigate this disaster as much as we can. There's already a lot that's in the pipeline, but we believe that we have a moral obligation to do everything we can to mitigate the scale of what is going to come. So for some context, see if I can move this where I can see it. Yep. So as Mark said, our global carbon emissions have continued to increase. This is global carbon emissions increasing decade after decade up until 2020 during the pandemic. There was a little dip and then we went back up, and now we're back at record carbon emissions. The generally discussed goal is to reach zero by 2050, which is getting closer all the time. But of course, as we know, we are still continuing in the wrong direction. Our carbon emissions on a global level continue to increase. So we are really just keep on driving forward in the wrong direction, and it's not acceptable. We have to change course. Global carbon emissions historically, obviously before fossil fuels were discovered, this wasn't an issue. This wasn't a problem. They've grown exponentially along with the global population, and those two are related. But carbon emissions have grown exponentially. As Mark was saying, United States, if you take the area here, we are responsible for the lion's share of historic carbon emissions. We're now at about 5 billion tons of CO2 equivalents per year, and China has now eclipsed us. US carbon emissions have been on a slight decline, but we're still at about 5. We're still about where we were in 1990, so no great improvement to really speak of. Our carbon emissions come from a variety of sectors. Again, why this is such a multifaceted problem and why we need to attack it from so many different angles. Transportation, electric power, industry, commercial and residential use, and agriculture are some of the major players. Here, so the latest IPCC report makes it clear no new fossil fuel projects can be opened. All right, so it's based on physics and math. It's been agreed by representatives from most of the world's governments, who spent the past week in Switzerland thrashing out the wording of a synthesis document that brings together everything established on the subject. Over the past 8 years, it is this: greenhouse gas emissions from existing fossil fuel infrastructure is more than enough already to push the world beyond 1.5 degrees of global heating compared with pre-industrial times. Obviously enough, this means that no more fossil fuel projects can be opened if the world is serious about living up to its commitments and avoiding significantly worsening climate crisis. So that's very clear cut. So we need to stop new projects from being developed. Guess which candidate said this? Number one, no more subsidies for fossil fuel industry, no more drilling on federal lands, no more drilling, including offshore, no ability for the oil industry to continue to drill, period, ends number one. Many of you may know that was said by Joe Biden in the debate, and it was a complete lie because he went ahead and is now outpacing Trump's record of approval of fossil fuel drilling permits on public lands, and approving 6,430 permits on public lands in its first 2 years, outpacing the Trump's record for its first 2 years. So we have no ally in Joe Biden. He's not listening to the science. In fact, responding to a lawsuit by conservation groups, the Biden administration officially rejected a rulemaking petition from more than 360 climate, indigenous, and conservation groups to phase out oil and gas extraction on public lands by 2035. So he has no interest in changing course. In fact, we know some of the more famous approvals of oil and gas projects that he's done. The WIllow Project, estimated 239 million metric tons of carbon dioxide over the 30-year lifetime. It actually doesn't add up to a lot of gigatons per year compared to the 5 we're doing now, but that's because we're already doing so much. And everything we add has like a 30-year lifespan and is just digging our hole even deeper. The LNG exports from the Alaska project is actually even worse, about almost 10 times worse, 0.05 gigatons per year, and opening huge swaths of the Gulf of Mexico to oil and gas leases, and approving the Mountain Valley Pipeline, and on and on and on. And so, we are not doing what we need to be doing in terms of stopping projects. And I want to point out that the rest of the world isn't doing what they ought to be doing either. And it's true. There are, this article points out an analysis of global data shows the WIllow Project represents a small fraction of hundreds of new oil and gas extraction projects approved in the past year across the world, including many more in the United States. And in the coming months, dozens of additional projects are expected to be approved. This is 2022 and 2023 data. But, here's the WIllow Project. Here's all the other new projects that have been approved. Look at Qatar, look at Saudi Arabia, look at Brazil. I want to point out that there is something we can do about this, and it would be a carbon tax on imports. So, we don't have a vote in what other countries do, but we can have influence. And one way we have influence is with our economic trading power. And we import a lot, especially, as we all know, from China, and China having a large carbon footprint. We don't just throw up our hands and say, well, there's nothing we can do. It's China. We can put a carbon tax on imports. And I want to point out that Europe has just done this. The European Union is ushering in a new era of international trade that could help rein in climate change. Lawmakers for the group of 27 countries adopted rules for taxing imports based on the amount of carbon dioxide that companies emit making those goods. Experts say it's the first time a major economy has married climate and trade policy. It could lead other countries to do the same. So we can focus on what we're doing, but we can also have an effect on what other countries are doing. All right. So one thing we can do locally, and it's not the only thing we can do, but Europe has already done this. More than 45 countries have already done this, have already put a price on carbon. This is simply saying that carbon is a pollutant and we want to discourage its production. And so we're going to put a tax on it. And I honestly feel like if we aren't even able to do that, we really have no hope of making progress. I just want to point out that here's Canada rolling out its carbon tax. And the trick is they packaged it as a price on pollution, not a tax, and they give the money back to the people. So that's what we could do. I call it it's called a carbon tax and dividend. I've come up with the phrase a universal carbon income. We could get about $2,000 a year to everybody just at an initial price. I have something on that somewhere else. Okay, so the EU has carbon pricing. They're working on tightening it up. States can do this. Washington State just started capping carbon emissions. There's a difference between a carbon cap and a carbon tax. Carbon tax, I think, is probably better. The key is that once you have it in place, you can ratchet it up. You can and reduce carbon use. If we don't make this less, if we're worried about people being able to afford things that causing carbon emissions, we're basically saying we're going to keep causing carbon emissions. It's a circular argument. But I think what we have to do is give the money back to the people. These fossil fuel companies are making record profits. So we tax the carbon, we distribute it to the people, and we keep them, and we keep life affordable. I mean, we have so many other problems with income inequality that we need to address in multiple ways. But we can do this in a way that doesn't make the situation worse. I want to read some quotes. Here's James Hansen. We have to level with the public that there has to be a price on carbon emissions. That is the only way we are going to be able to move toward a carbon-free economy. And in 2021, he wrote an op-ed, a carbon tax is key to addressing the climate crisis, and carbon dividends could get Congress to support one. All right, here's another quote from Jeffrey Sachs at Columbia. A straightforward carbon tax has vast advantages. It can be levied upstream at a few dozen places, at the wellhead, the mine face, and the liquid natural gas depot, rather than at thousands or tens of thousands of businesses. A carbon tax covers the entire economy, including automobiles, household use, other units impossible to reach in cap and trade. A carbon tax puts a clear price on carbon emissions for many years ahead, while cap and trade system gives a highly fluctuating spot price. A carbon tax raises a clear amount of revenue, which can be used for targeted purposes or rebated to the public one way or another, while the revenues from a cap and trade system are likely to be bargained away well before the first trade ever takes place. Here's Charles Komanoff, co-director of the Carbon Tax Center. Decarbonizing the world's energy systems will entail scaling up hundreds of innovative technologies, some of which don't exist yet, as well as rewiring humanity's ecological consciousness. Only a carbon tax can quickly drive the across-the-board transition from fossil fuels to renewable and efficient energy. Its key attributes make it far superior to cap and trade. And if you don't take their word for it, listen to the IPCC, who says policies reflecting a high price on emissions are necessary in models to achieve a cost-effective 1.5 degree pathways. High confidence. That's from the IPCC report. All things being equal, modeling okay, blah blah blah. In its landmark report, UN panel says putting a price on carbon dioxide emissions would be central for getting global warming under control. This concept of carbon pricing received another implicit endorsement Monday from the Nobel Prize Committee, which gave William Nordhaus a share of the 2018 Nobel Prize in Economics for, among other things, making it clear that, quote, the most efficient remedy for the problems caused by greenhouse gas emissions would be a global scheme of carbon taxes that are uniformly imposed on all countries. Americans support a carbon. 3 out of 4 people already support this idea. But like with many things that are popular, we can't get them passed because Congress doesn't represent us. Even 75% of Republicans under 40. So this is not a fringe idea. This is not politically undoable. This is our representatives not representing us. The United States Conference of Mayors strongly urges the U.S. Congress to pass legislation that imposes a price on carbon emissions sufficient to reduce carbon emissions in line with ambitions detailed in the Paris Agreement. I'm not going to go through this slide. There are some counter arguments that people have made about a carbon tax and dividend. And I found this page that has like the arguments and the rebuttals. This is a scene from Soylent Green. Have you guys seen Soylent Green? Does anybody know what this scene is? So I know you can't talk, but this is the guy who agrees to be euthanized so that he can become food because all our ecological systems have collapsed and now we're eating people. Sorry to give away the ending, spoiler alert. But but when he's being euthanized, he gets to view on a big screen. He gets to see what the earth used to be like when we had biodiversity, when we had animals, when we had a healthy planet. And this scene is so touching to me and so sad and such a warning of the direction we're headed, to think that we could really lose what we've got and we shouldn't take it for granted. So I just wanted a couple more thoughts before I stop, and just quickly to say that, because I haven't talked that long, have I? So I just wanted to say that there are so many things we can do on the local level. Run for office. There's this march coming up on the 17th. I wanted to point out the activities of this local group in New Haven called the New Haven Climate Movement. They're really impressive. They've really got their act together. They're doing campaigns all the time. They're lobbying the mayor. They're keeping track of local and state issues and policies. They're running, trying to get climate education in schools, trying to electrify things, building efficiencies and renewability. So, and look at them. They're great. So we need more people like this in every town, being active, however they can find to take action, get engaged, find out what your government is doing, and find out what they're doing wrong, run for office and tell them how, and then make them do it differently. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Justin. I don't know if you need to stop sharing the screen or not. Maybe you don't, but I'll just point that out. Um, a couple of things I just wanted to quickly point back out, which I hadn't really emphasized much in the initial presentation. Certainly, the concept of environmental justice is really critical. It is people of color and low income people, both in the United States and across the planet, that bear the brunt of pollution. That is where we locate, the coal plants and the oil plants and the power plants in this country. Um, and the World Health Organization, estimates about 8 million people a year already are dying from air pollution. Um, so it's important when we talk about climate solutions that we ensure that the needs of the victims are met, and that includes both here in the United States, but it also means that the United States needs to take, along with the other industrial polluters, responsibility for helping the rest of the world, particularly developing countries, um, both reduce their own emissions, be able to transition to a sustainable economy that provides a decent standard of living for their residents, which is often, not the case, and also to pay for, mitigation and resiliency efforts. That certainly was part of the initial Green New Deal and the concept of a just transition. And that, just transition means not only helping everybody, but also guaranteeing that people, for instance, now presently employed, by the fossil fuel and nuclear power industries, in fact, when they lose their jobs, have their wages, income, guaranteed for, at least 5 years, that they have, front of the line in terms of commitment towards training and being put into a new job, and also communities. A lot of communities, unfortunately, become very dependent upon the tax revenues from these local power plants. And, oh, we can't shut down this power plant because it would mean enormous tax hikes or shutting down our schools, things of that nature. I did glance over in the initial presentation the rights of nature. That is something that the Green EcoAction Committee has been doing a lot of work on. It basically means recognizing that um, nature, that river and forest and mountains have a right to be protected, just like individuals should have the right to be protected. I believe the Ohio Green Party has been, quite active on that. I know the Florida Green Party has done quite a bit of work. I think the Ohio Green Party was involved in some of the legislation around trying to protect Lake Ontario. Lizzie Adams from Florida has been a person really been leading us on that. I know she's talking a lot about the rights in Antarctica, trying to protect Antarctica. And we had had a seminar webinar on the issue of plastics. Plastics in themselves is a real problem. A lot of pollution, a lot of toxic materials, but increasingly the fossil fuel industry is turning to plastics as their safety net. That many of the plastics increasingly are being made from waste from fossil fuels. They're literally investing billions and billions of dollars in ethanol cracker plants. That many of these production facilities come in places like Mississippi and Kansas Alley and Texas, communities that are both low income and people of color. And water has been something we've been looking at more recently, particularly some of our members from some of the western states like New Mexico. Water should be a human right. We should not be having people sell bottles of water. That's a crazy marketing scheme that we need to end. But we need to ensure that water does not become privatized and remains sort of public good. At this point, we want to open it up for comments and questions. I know there's been a lot of comments or statements in the chat, but if you have a question, if you could put that at the top. I don't know if Lou, if you have any luck in monitoring any of the questions that come up to date.
I haven't seen any particular questions. Wait, there was one early on. Let me go back and look.
I think Marvin might have a question. You want to put it in the chat?
Well, well, I just want to make this comment. I'm a little disappointed that, the single biggest polluter on the planet is the US military. We could close 500 military bases and make a huge cut in the pollution across the planet. I'm shocked that this has not been mentioned. Thank you.
Right,
I will say, in my handy dandy book, putting out the Planetary Fire, which is basically just an organizing guide for people, there is a section on the military. We have had we did do a webinar about climate in the military. I mentioned David Schwarzman a lot because he's a scientist as part of the EcoAction committee. Yes, first of all, we did say that we need to cut the military budget by at least 50%. And that, of course, starts by shutting down those 800, military bases in other countries across the planet. There's debate about how large the military impact is on climate emissions. I mean, yes, the United States military is the single largest user of oil on the planet. But David Schwarzman argues that, in fact, the United States military maybe about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, and it's about 5% internationally. He still makes the point, definitely we need to shut down the military and imperialism as part of the climate solution. But yes, they have a negative impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but a lot of it is also just imperialism. And, the idea we have to stop these wars for oil. Obviously, the Ukraine at the present time has had a big impact on the energy issues. Many of us hope that it would lead to increased commitment to build more renewable energy. In fact, what it's led to is record profits by the oil and gas companies. Justin, do you want any comment?
Yes, I absolutely agree that we should be cutting the military for multiple reasons that include the climate. I just did a quick little research and found out the U.S. military emissions are about 51 million metric tons of CO2 equivalently in the last 2 years. So that's about 25 million per year, which is large, but compared to the U.S. overall at 5 trillion, it's still a small amount. But that's just, again, that just speaks to what an incredible amount of greenhouse gases the U.S. emits through all of our economic activity across the economic board.
There is an important question in the chat. Where does one get the book? As I said, you can go, it is actually published by the Green Education and Legal Fund, which is a 501c nonprofit that promotes basically the green agenda and green values. GELFNY.org. And you can go to that and you can, read it for free online, and each of the chapters is up there on the webpage. You can actually also download it for free, full PDF, or you can go to some of your favorite corporate booksellers and buy it. We do hope in the future to have bulk sales that will be available. If you go to gelfny.org, there is a pull down menu for Planetary Fire. You can pull it down to get the individual chapters, but if you hit just the top one, putting out the Planetary Fire, all the information about download in is there. Mr. Baldwin, Jack, you have a question?
Yes,
Comment?
I want to bring up the question that I wrote early in chat, which is, should we consider nationalizing the fossil fuel industry so as to draw it down? Is that a possible policy proposal?
I'll go first and Justin goes second. Next time Justin's going to go first. I had this argument a bit with my socialist friends. In Naomi Klein's book, I can't remember which one, she points out that 70% of the fossil fuels on the planet are already publicly owned. So the idea that public ownership in of itself is going to solve the climate crisis is not borne out by the evidence. Yes, we should nationalize the oil companies and the fossil fuel companies and all our energy system. But that goes back, I always said there's two things. We need public ownership, but you also need public control. And, just turning the fossil fuel companies, over to the board of directors selected by the politicians and the utility companies and the banks and the 1%, that won't be a solution. Justin, you have anything to add?
I think that I favor that. Yeah, I mean, I think that Cornel West has proposed that, and I think yeah, I mean, the under the extreme circumstances of what we're facing, and these businesses are driven by profit, and nationalizing them so that we can operate them in the interest of our survival is a reasonable proposal. Absolutely.
So I do see a written question in the chat that Lou posted, but I'm going to give Orson the opportunity to ask his question first, and then Justin, you can answer it first.
What question?
Yeah.
Orson's going to ask a question or comment.
Well, there's a lot of questions that come to mind. Try to think of which one to ask. I guess one question would be regarding mining of solar panels and minerals that are in solar panels, or mining to build electric vehicles. The mining that's involved with that, and also windmills. I saw someplace alternative structures for windmills, how to build them in such a way that they don't harm birds and ecosystems. Or I saw something about plastic birds nests or something. I haven't really looked into it. But any alternative ways to make solar, wind, electric vehicles in ways that don't harm communities, like there's like cobalt or something mined for electric vehicles and damages communities in African countries. And so any ways to make alternative energy more sustainable,
Yes, I think we need to be aware that right now there are global forces competing for control of the resources that are used in renewable technologies, the cobalt and the lithium, and that this is a potential fuel for global conflict and war, and for exploitation and of local people, and for pollution. And we have to be cognizant and active as we can to try and prevent the worst of that. I mean, we have to find a way to do this. I mean, there is no alternative. We can't keep using fossil fuels. I mean, even if we could, they're finite anyway. And even if there wasn't the global warming issue. So we are in no doubt in a difficult situation, and we have to try and find a way to do this that respects people around the planet and their natural rights. I mean, I don't trust that our current government is interested in doing that, which is why we feel we need new leadership for our country in the Green Party. I know that there is a lot of lithium at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean in these little rocks that sit on the floor, and I'm not sure. I haven't really looked into what the environmental impact would be of harvesting them, but I know that people are looking into harvesting those right now. I forgot what they're called. They're these little rocks, and they're just like condensed rocks of minerals, including lithium. And there's a lot of them. They're all spread out all over the Pacific floor. And I don't know if that's preferable to the land mining that's going on now. But, we have, in my opinion, we have overshot in so many ways the Earth's capacity to sustain us. And, human resource use is going to be our population times our resource use per person. And at 8 billion people, it's a much harder problem to solve. And, we're stuck between a rock and a hard place. I don't think there's any easy solutions. I don't know. I'll put other thoughts on that.
I will just mention, when I wrote the book, it was basically just sat down as what are all the questions people have about renewable energy and the fight to the transition to a clean energy future. So page 62 on talks about some of the environmental impacts of renewable energy, such as access to minerals. All uses basically have environmental impacts, usually some negative, and so one does have to address that. Offshore wind, which I've been a big proponent of, you actually need to pay attention when you cite the offshore wind platform that you don't put it in the migration path um, for whales. One has to look about the impact upon marine life. There often usually are some solutions or some alternatives. Wind has not really been a major problem for birds. I hear bats now, a little bit more of a problem. You got to work on how you try to solve those problems. I think it's also one of the reasons why you want public ownership, because there's a lot more chance if there's public ownership and democratic control that these type of issues will be taken seriously, whereas private developers don't get it. Recently I had a meeting with some people from Ocean Action in New Jersey who are very opposed to offshore wind. And I could feel their concern, because they say, listen, we've been spending the last 30 years fighting against the industrialization and pollution of the ocean. And we're concerned that this offshore wind industry is a way to do industrialization. And I said, well, let's work to make sure that does not occur. A couple issues or questions are in the chat. Do a quick one. The issue of degrowth, also in my book, that's one of the things we had some debate in EcoAction. I think basically most of us in the Greens will say, yes, we need to reduce the, first of all, we need to move away from a society, from an economy that requires growth in order to be able to sustain itself. That's a big problem. But we also need to recognize that the biggest problem or bigger problem is that those of us in United States, Canada, Europe, Japan have a much bigger carbon footprint than people in third world countries. And so a lot of degrowth need to be taking place in the industrial countries. We need to allow some way for the poorer nations to continue to have some growth in order to increase their standard of living, and that goes about how are we going to share resources. But another question in the chat was, how will we transition poorer homeowners from fossil fuel heating systems and transportation to fossil fuel free systems? You got to give them money. I put in air heat pumps in my home. I live in a pretty cold climate, upstate New York. Cost about $15,000 to do the whole home. Actually didn't make any sense economically because I built my own passive solar home, super insulated 35 years ago, very low energy use. But I wanted to see how they operate, so I could talk about it. Did get a $5,000 rebate from the local utility company, so it was about $11,000 to put it in. I'm at the age where I can afford that type of thing. Most working people, younger people cannot afford it. We have to increase the financial incentives. In New York State, they've talked about providing $1 billion to $2 billion a year in subsidies to allow people to purchase things like air heat pumps or ground source heating, geothermal and stuff like that. And then that comes into the question about where do you raise the money? Justin outlined the carbon tax, carbon dividend. Some people will say some percentage of that money raised through a carbon tax should go to these type of subsidies for renewable energy. One way you can provide, a rebate. And other people in New York State, one of the pieces of legislation which was blocked but was discussed this year was something called the Climate Superfund Act, and that went after the 30 largest overall polluters. And it was actually a way to try to get after the oil and gas companies, because one of the reasons people argue against state carbon taxes, if you tax them in New York, they'll just move to Pennsylvania, or they'll just raise the prices at the fuel pump and it'll make low-income people pay more money. But we need to make the polluters pay. We have to raise subsidies for the upcoming course. One of the things we did in New York, and I won't go too long, but it was a great bill, and it was called, I think, like New York Jobs, New York Homes. But the idea was they're going to try to decarbonize 1 million homes in New York State, including renters. And if you could go out and get a free energy audit, and if the audit showed that an investment in insulation or a different type of boiler or air heat pumps would save money over 7 years, that the utility companies would actually have to finance those energy retrofits, and they would get the money paid back through the lower energy bills over 7 years. Ithaca, City of Ithaca, upstate college town, but they are raising, I think, $1 billion in order to finance the decarbonization of all buildings, not just public buildings. But those are the type of things that the Green Party should be articulating. Are there other? I'm sorry, Justin, you want to add anything? Degrowth, or how do we finance the low-income people getting energy efficiency stuff?
Well, yeah, we need to invest in that as a country, and as states, we need to give them money. Like you said, we need to be helping people pay for to transition. And one way we can save money is cutting the military. Another way we can save money is by going to single-payer healthcare. That'll save $500 billion a year. So there are ways of doing it, and we just need to have, I think, the political will.
Let's see. Any other questions or comments? Just looking at some of the comments in the thing, yes, we do go to talk about mass transit. We do not want to replace 300 million, individually owned fossil fuel cars with 300 million, electric vehicles. I sometimes say is, I somewhat disagree with people who say we need to raise the level of mass transit in the United States to at least the level of mass transit in most third world countries, because they say, why should we be criticizing the third world countries who tend to have much better mass transit, than the United States? And that was, a lot of that was a conscious political decision by the automobile industry to, destroy mass transit in order to increase the demand for private vehicles. I live in a rural community. It's only 12 miles from the state capital in Albany. One bus, 1 day a week. That's all you got. You have to travel 5-6 miles to another town in order to get on a bus line. And when I went to Costa Rica, which has about one of the worst mass transit systems in Central America, you stand on most roads, a bus drives by, every 20 minutes, no matter where you live. And you got to be able to promote cycling and pedestrians and things of that nature as well. Justin, you have something?
Yeah, I wanted to address. There was a question about meat in the chat.
Yes.
Absolutely a huge issue. Doing a little research here, food production accounts for 1/4 of the world's greenhouse gas emissions and takes up half the planet's habitable surface. I remember learning in college that about half of the crops we grow are fed to livestock. So imagine that the amazing amount of land use, that's just, half of our arable land we're using to grow grains and things that we feed not to ourselves, not to people, but to livestock. So it's a very inefficient way of using of feeding ourselves, of getting our calories. And the mass of livestock on Earth now outweighs wildlife by 15 to 1. For every person on Earth, there are 3 chickens. Meat and dairy account for 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Yes, so meat and dairy, extremely relevant issue. How do we tackle that? How do we tackle that? I mean, certainly as individuals, we're going to be aware of that and try to choose our diets accordingly. It's a bit more difficult. How do we address that on a societal level? Taxation again can be a tool to reduce the production and consumption of products that are harmful to the environment, like a cigarette tax. That's just off the top of my head, but I'm open to other ideas.
I will mention in terms of the meat and vegetables, that was something that in last year that the IPCC for the first time really addressed the need to move to a more plant, based diet. A lot of places like the Amazon, which are being destroyed. I think Amazon just this year has passed from being a carbon sink to a carbon emitter because of the amount of clear cutting that has taken place. But a lot of these lands are being clear cut in order to turn into grazing for cattle and stuff like that. And I forget, we are having a forum on August 14th on agriculture and climate. We'll be addressing that in more detail. But I forget the exact percentage of greenhouse gas emissions that come from the United States from agriculture. Well, off the top of my head, but don't quote me on it, I think it's about 18%. But that's an undercount because we, in fact, export a lot of our emissions to other countries, third world countries, to raise cattle and stuff like that, where they see the emissions, and that's not counted in our greenhouse budget. At the same time, of course, that's been one of the Republicans' attack points. The green nannies want to tell you can't buy Happy Meals at Burger King or McDonald's and stuff like that. Well, yeah, somewhat that's true. But it's a more healthy diet. It's more affordable. If you cut down one day a week less from eating meat, that would be helpful. But there are a lot of debates about sort of the, lifestyle changes. But I also remember a friend of mine was a big meat eater, and we went to a conference, a bunch of nuns, and they served us tofu, and he just could not believe that he was eating tofu. He said, "Oh, you're just joking. This tastes too good to be tofu." And a lot of it is just teaching people how to prepare, sort of alternative diets. So we're getting towards the end. I don't know, Justin, you have any closing? Like, how can people take this and do stuff with it? Now that we've given them some ideas.
Be active in your local Green Party. We need people to help us with party building. We need people to run the machinery of the Green Party. We need candidates. We need people to serve as secretaries and treasurers and outreach coordinators and help with graphics and websites. We need to grow as a party that takes people power. I think we are the party that is prioritizing this issue. What other party is doing that? So we need to build a party. Of course, also be active with local climate groups. Find your local climate groups and get involved with them. You can do both, or as your time allows. But yes, and talk to people about it, and talk about it with your friends. Talk about it on social media. Don't remain silent. Raise the alarm bells. Yeah.
Across the planet, Green Party candidates have been surging in elections in recent years because other countries are a little bit more cognizant about the seriousness of climate change. And of course, virtually every other democracy other than United States, UK, and Canada, uses proportional representation. So it makes it easier for people to vote for what they believe in rather than what they fear. But in Sweden, for instance, a couple of years ago, I think the Green Party vote doubled because as the vote was taking place, the wildfires from the tundra up in the Arctic was coming into Sweden, and that was so visible that people say, boy, we need, sort of some leadership. One of the advantages outside of places like New York, where most of our elections are partisan, in many parts of the country, local elections are nonpartisan. And in those races, the Green Party actually wins 25 to 30% of the elections. And so running to articulate a climate agenda, especially among young people, is going to help. Justin.
I also want to just express my opinion that a lot of these climate organizations, if they're supporting Joe Biden, they're not really a climate organization.
And I will say, I did, as somebody who spent much of my career working in the nonprofit sector, there's often a real big difference between the groups that are funded by foundations and have staff versus the grassroots groups that are more people who are working because they're concerned about protecting their family and protecting their community. And it tends to be the well-funded groups that are much, much more tied to the Democratic Party. And it's much more the grassroots groups. I mean, for instance, when we had the fight in New York State starting in 2010, I mentioned earlier, to call for a halt to fracking, the Green Party called for a ban on fracking. And that was the position of most of the grassroots groups, particularly in the communities in the southern tier and central New York, where fracking was most likely taking place. The big groups, the ones with money, the ones that had foundation grants, they thought that was a too radical position. And so they all called for a moratorium to study the impact of fracking. How bad was it for the water? How bad was it for noise? And we said, you don't need to study it. You can debate whether it's bad for noise or the neighborhood, but you can't debate that natural gas is a fossil fuel. And we have to stop using fossil fuels, period. Ban it. In 2 years, the grassroots groups were so strong, and the grassroots groups would allow the Green Party candidates like Howie Walker to speak at events. The big groups would shut the door on us. In 2 years, the entire movement in New York State changed to call for a ban on fracking because the grassroots activists, were so committed to that. But I think the Green Party is also, I always think the Green Party should be the golden, if not the green standard, when it comes to environmental issues and climate. We should articulate what is the correct answers to these solutions and not play the game that these big groups play, what is politically pragmatic. We should say, what is pragmatic to save life on the planet? And once we've saved life on the planet, we can work from there. I always tell the story, a gentleman who I really respect a lot, and he's been quite good, Mark Jacobson. And he's done a lot of the studies, professor at Stanford, on how quickly can we use, with existing technology, move to 100% clean energy. And he had done a study along with Mark Ruffalo and others in New York State about how we could go to 100% clean energy by 2030 without the need for fracking, for fossil fuels. And then he was doing studies nationwide, got a lot of funding, and he started to talk about 2050. And so when I drafted this law in New York State using his plan, and I called him up and I said, Mark, what is it? Can we do this by 2030 or we need it 2050? And he said, well, I've always been clear, not true, but he said, I've always been clear that 2030 is what is technologically feasible. 2050 is giving the politicians and the business people 20 years of wiggle room. And what I said was, Mark, the politicians and the business people are always taking wiggle room. They don't need our encouragement. So we're going to call for what is needed, and then they can play from there. But that type of debate happens all the time within the climate community. And I think it's really important for the Green Party to have a vocal voice and say, no, you should not be trying to sell this solution to the fossil fuel industry. You should be trying to actually solve the problem. And one of the problems with politicians is the main thing they're concerned about is getting elected at the initial election cycle. So they only think 2 to 4 years out. They don't think 20, 25, 30 years out. And I think that's one of the things the Green Party can really do. And I think it's true that the Green Party is viewed worldwide as a political party that is really the voice for climate reality. And I think we need to do a little better job of highlighting that. And that's why we're going to be marching together on September 17th.
September
And
17th.
it's a Sunday.
We have to wrap up.
Okay. So I want to thank people for joining us. I don't know, Justin, you have any closing remarks? Justin, where will we be posting your slides?
I put in the chat a link. If you just go to the Eventee page for this event, there's a place to download them for anybody. So,
Okay.
and thanks everybody for coming, and thanks for everything you do.
And we do post a lot of it. We have a Facebook page for EcoAction Committee. We also have a web page, gp.org/ecoaction_committee on the national page. You can find us there on the thing. Hopefully we'll get the list of attendees, so we'll send you a notice about the August 14th webinar that we're doing on agriculture. Lou, is any closing remarks? Lou Novak has been our technical support person for the National Party.
No, thank you, Mark. Thank you, Justin, for a very informative and interesting presentation, giving us plenty of ammunition to move forward and address climate change. So appreciate it very much. And thanks to all of those who attended, and particularly for those who provided some questions that were very well answered. Thanks for coming, and enjoy the rest of the annual national meeting, folks. Take care.
Thank you.